Hello, everyone. I am Marie Dorini, and I'm the Paris director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Welcome to Read Hall. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today on the occasion of the publication of Adam Shatz's biography of Frantz Fanon, The Rebels Clinic, The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon, which was just released practically simultaneously in the UK, the US, and France, to rave reviews. And we have books by Juan and Adam that are sold by the Red Wheelbarrow, and Juan and Adam have kindly agreed to sign books. Unfortunately, David's book hasn't arrived, but it will be available at the Red Wheelbarrow in a couple of days, and you all should know where it is if you don't know already, Rue de Médicis. Voilà. Adam is the US editor of the London Review of Books and a contributor to the New York Times Magazine, the London Review, sorry, you're the US editor of the London Review of Books, and a frequent contributor to the New York Times Magazine, the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and other publications. He's the author of Writers and Missionaries, Essays on Radical Imagination, and the host of the podcast Myself with Others. His deep knowledge of France, the Arab world, the Algerian war, jazz, cinema, and literature have inspired countless essays in clear, elegant prose, with nuanced arguments that ask more questions than they answer. His contributions to the political and cultural conversation are simply incontournables. And in the words of my mother, who's here tonight and who often tells me this, I'll read anything Adam writes. And she does. Adam wears his erudition lightly, which comes in handy when you're writing about Frantz Fanon. A man of contradictions and an unavoidable figure of decolonization whose appeal and prescience is resurrecting him as an icon today, Fanon needed a writer like Adam to make him come alive on the page, warts and all. I've heard Adam say that had he known what he was getting himself into when he began researching this book, he might not have written it at all. And all I can say is that ignorance is bliss, because Fanon definitely lucked out with you as his biographer, as you have produced an important, layered, and endlessly rich biography. I often pinch myself that I have the job that I have, and tonight is definitely a pinching moment to be able to greet on the same stage three of today's most prominent intellectual voices, Adam Shatz, David Scott, and Juan Gabriel Vásquez, who are both Juan and Gabriel current fellows at the Institute. That's pretty fantastic. David Scott is Ruth and William Lubig Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University. He is the author of several works on colonialism, postcoloniality, ethics, and memory. His latest book, Irreparable Evil, an essay in moral and repertory history, just came out last month with Columbia University Press, and that's the book you can go get at the Wheelbarrow in a few days. At the Institute, David is working on a biography of Stuart Hall. He's also the founder and editor of the journal Small Axe, the director of the Small Axe Project, and has curated several art exhibitions, and he was the curatorial director of Pressure, the 2022 Kingston Biennale. So to quote one of David's fellows earlier today in the kitchen, listening to David casually speak about any topic is for the rest of us witnessing the unfolding of a master lecture. And I will add, having been there many times myself, a lecture readily accessible to everyone, the experts and the learned audience, on absolutely any given topic. Another master of talking about absolutely any given topic is Juan Gabriel Vásquez, a novelist, poet, translator, columnist, essayist, and as of a few weeks ago, a sculptor. Juan is the author of more books than I can name here and has won more prizes than I can list here. But his remarkable retrospective, which came out last year in France and in the US, is a magnificent example of historical figures making it into fiction. Right now he's working on a novel about Félix Abursin, a little-known Colombian sculptor who died in Paris in 1992. And as serendipity would have it, she studied welding and sculpture in the Atelier de la Grande Chaumière right here on our street. Hence, Juan going all actor studio about this subject matter and taking up sculpture where she did it too. I'm really grateful to both Juan and David for being in conversation with Adam tonight. In a few minutes, you'll discover, unsurprisingly, that they both have many, many questions for Adam. And after their conversation, they will be taking questions from all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marie. And so Juan, shall I start off? Adam, it's a great pleasure to be here in this conversation with you. And I want to begin by thanking you for such an elegant, provocative, subtle, moving book. It was a great pleasure to read, and I learned a vast amount from it. Someone who's been reading Frantz Fanon over and over again since the 1970s. I want to begin with perhaps in some way the obvious question, kind of my kind of question, which is a question about the present. Why Frantz Fanon now? And what is it that you are attempting to put before us about Frantz Fanon that you think has not been sufficiently understood about Frantz Fanon? And furthermore, why this form? Why does Fanon need now a biographical form? What can that teach us?
I said, thank you, David. That was a wonderful question, a rather series of questions, and if I responded comprehensively, that might take all night. But before I answer that, there are a few people I want to thank. First of all, I want to thank David and Juan Gabriel. David's elegiac reckoning with the legacy of colonialism has exerted a not inconsiderable influence on my own thinking, and I've been a passionate reader of Juan Gabriel's work for some time and consider his book Retrospective to be one of the finest books I've read in recent years about the revolutionary experience. For those of you who are not aware of the book, it's about a group of a Colombian family that decides to move to China at the height of the Cultural Revolution. I'll leave it there. It's a fascinating book. And there are a few others I need to thank. In the front row, my friend and translator, Marc Saint-Upéry, who has produced an absolutely luminous translation of the book for La Découverte. Jeremy Harding, my colleague at the London Review of Books, who was my first editor on this book, and without whose work this would have been a very different book. And two of my friends in Paris, Lila Jacinto and Arun Kapil, with whom I've had a conversation about matters political, and with Arun, Algerian, for many, many years. So thank you very much. And lastly, but not least, Marie Dorigny for inviting me to do this event. Marie is a dear friend, and it's a pinching moment for me as well. Fanon in the present. You know, when I was working on this book, I had imagined that it would be read largely through the prism of Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests, but this book was published just a few months before, just a few months after October 7. And so, of course, it ends up being read through a rather different prism, through the prism of the Israel-Palestine struggle, about which Fanon said nothing, in fact. But he's a figure of great consequence for Palestinian intellectuals and activists. And I think these two examples hint at the multidimensional quality of the work. It speaks to a great number of conflicts. I could also add the the very different reactions that people in the global south and people in the global south and people in the global north have had to the South African case at the International Court of Justice. I think this is also an indication of the kind of bifurcated or divided world that Fanon wrote about in his 1961 manifesto, The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon was one of the great chroniclers and analysts, and of course participant writers of the anti-colonial era. And so, in a sense, you could say that he describes a world that no longer exists, a world that he took part in dismantling, and yet the structures of that world and some of the habits of thought and many of the divisions, in an almost ghostly manner, continue to haunt the present. And so, Fanon continues, in some sense, to be a guide to understanding the world that we inhabit. I mean, his writings, for example, on the black body, I think, are very prefigurative of work that has been produced by subsequent scholars. His understanding of the psychological and even physical effects of political oppression in his own day, there was no way that he could verify these intuitions, but I think a great deal of work on these subjects have vindicated some of his intuitions. I, in fact, read quite recently a piece in the New York Times about the high rates of depression and mental illness among African Americans as a result of the proliferation of police killings. I think that Fanon was onto this very early. In fact, he was onto it even before he began publishing. It was something that he first began to reckon with as a doctor in Lyon when he published his second article, The So-Called North African Syndrome. Fanon's understanding of the dynamics of violence and counter-violence, or of violence, political violence and repression, apply, I think, with great power to the situation in Israel-Palestine. The struggle over Palestine is not identical to the Algerian struggle for independence, but there are certainly rich parallels. And the Palestinians certainly believe that to be the case, and not surprisingly, many have almost adopted Fanon. Although, as I mentioned earlier, Fanon said nothing. I mean, Fanon was not. Fanon, I think, has 2 or 3 references to Israel in his books, and none regard the Palestinians. But psychiatrists such as Sama Jaber, a psychiatrist based in, I think she's based in East Jerusalem and also the West Bank, has written extensively about Fanon. So has the Israeli left-wing psychiatrist Ruhama Martan, one of the founders of Physicians for Human Rights in Israel. So the work has, I guess, what the French would call an actuality, a contemporaneity. It combines the analytic and the visceral, and I believe that it continues to speak to the present, even though in some ways, of course, it is anachronistic.
The biographical form.
The biographical form, yes. I admit that I was attracted to the biographical form because I've often written about committed intellectuals, and Fanon was the embodiment of the so-called intellectual engagé. It was not for nothing that Sartre had such admiration for Fanon. I think, in a sense, Sartre envied him. He was both a writer and a quote-unquote man of action. And it seemed to me that Fanon's life and the dilemmas that he confronted could also be used as a way of thinking about what intellectuals gain from their association with liberation movements and also what they lose, and to reflect on the antinomies or pitfalls of engagement. Another reason is that I always felt that to really understand Fanon's writing, and let's remember, Fanon lived a very short life. He died when he was 36 years old of leukemia in Bethesda, Maryland, of all places, a subject we can address later. But in this very short life, he produced a considerable amount of work, but he was not sitting at a desk. He was walking around his office, pacing and dictating either to his wife, Josie, or to his secretary, Marie-Jeanne Manuelon. These were intended as, for the most part, as interventions, even as works of propaganda. So how do we understand the shorthand that he was using? Because Fanon often wrote in a kind of shorthand. The work is often dense and full of technical jargon, but also shot through with passages of poetry that owe much to his formation in Martinique and the debt to figures like Aimé Césaire, for that matter, Léon Gontran Damas or Jacques Roumain, and so it seemed to me that to properly decipher the Fanon text, which appears to be quite legible, but is in fact very intricate and elusive, you have to understand something about Fanon's life, about the extreme situations to which he was drawn. Fanon sought out danger. Let's not joke around. I mean, there's no question that Fanon had a taste for challenges, some of them existential challenges. And so I felt that to really understand Fanon, you had to understand who he was, what he was doing at particular times and in particular places, and that the life would illuminate the work, and that the work would also illuminate the life.
And the death also illuminate the work. There is before Juan jumps in, there is a beautiful letter that Samuel Beckett writes to Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse was an admirer of Beckett and wrote to Beckett asking him to describe for him the structure of his writing. And Beckett wrote back to Marcuse saying that he was once in a hospital here in Paris, and the person in the bed beside him, who was dying of cancer, screamed all night. And that screaming is the structure of my writing, says Beckett. And I have often thought that The Wretched of the Earth, in some sense, is that kind of text. It has the structure of the screaming of somebody who is dying of leukemia.
I love the idea. I also just love the idea of Marcuse and Beckett corresponding. I thank you very much. I hadn't known about that. And it's funny, too, the association with Marcuse, because Marcuse, of course, was part of that group of radical writers who were published by Grove Press along with Fanon in the 1960s. You would often find the two of them on a remainder table. It's quite a shame that they never met, although Marcuse did become aware of Fanon's writing. I think that's a really interesting observation, and it seems to me also that the idea of the scream or the cry is very much a part of the West Indian intellectual inheritance, le cri noir, the black cry, the black shout that Aimé Césaire evokes in his poetry. Is this the work of a dying man? I believe that it is, and perhaps it also accounts for some of the incoherences of the book. I mean, this is a work that is a manifesto. It was directed when Fanon wrote it to militants in what was then called the Third World. It's important to recall that when Fanon wrote The Wretched of the Earth, he knew that the anti-colonial struggles were going to win. He was in no doubt of that. The anti-colonial revolutionaries were the winners. They weren't the losers. the empires were falling. The question was, would there be a revolution within the revolution? Would a social revolution transform the character of the anti-colonial struggle, or would the anti-colonial struggle result in the creation of essentially dictatorships dominated by what he scathingly called the national bourgeoisie, replacing the colonizers, Africanizing, he actually used the term negrifying, even more contemptuously, certain professions, and failing to really transform social relations, failing to deliver power to what Fanon would have called the masses. And so he was full of fear and even dread at the direction of these revolutions, in part because of what he had observed within the Algerian struggle. When he was in Tunis, he encountered an FLN that was very different from the FLN that had recruited him in Algeria. Fanon knew the romance and the excitement and the thrill of the so-called FLN of the interior, which was a very different FLN. He was meeting with militant leaders of Wilaya 4, Wilaya 4, most of them Kabyle, many of them Marxists, who shared his very modernist vision of what Algeria might be after the war. This was a vision that was propounded by the Kabyle leader, Aban Ramdan, the architect of the so-called Congress of Sumam in 1956, which envisioned an Algeria that would be multi-ethnic, progressive, secular. I'm not anti-religious, but it would certainly not be an Islamic state. Anti-authoritarian, not in the sense that we might have today, but certainly by comparison with other post-independence regimes at the time. And when Fanon was in Tunisia, he became aware that the FLN of the interior was losing ground, in large part because the French had crushed it during the Battle of Algiers, and that the so-called Army of the Frontiers, the FLN of the exterior, was eclipsing it. And this was led by Colonel Houari Boumediene and by the FLN's intelligence chief, Abdelhafid Boussouf, around whom gathered a group of FLN cadres known as the Boussouf Boys. And their vision of Algeria was more a kind of Islamo-populism. It was also very authoritarian. The intelligence services would become the spinal cord of the post-independence regime. And so you could say that this book is a message of apocalyptic hope and also a warning. And yet another incoherence, which we could perhaps talk about later, is the contrast between the first chapter on violence and the last chapter on colonial warfare and mental disorders, in which Fanon anatomizes the trauma inflicted by violence, not just anti-colonial violence, but also not just colonial violence, but also anti-colonial violence. And so there is this tension between the celebration of violence as a form of shock therapy, as something that will provide the colonized with therapeutic benefits, and the very tragic vision in that last chapter. So Fanon is rushing to finish this book. He wants people, he actually writes to his editor, François Maspero, because he's anxious about whether Maspero, the publishing house, has enough connections in the third world. He's not particularly concerned whether the book is read in France. He wants to make sure that it's read by the people who are going to overthrow the colonial regimes and set up new governments. So I think in that sense, yes, it is perhaps a scream or an expression of deep concern about the fate of these revolutions.
Adam, can I ask you about the intrahistory of the book? Your relationship as a biographer to the subject, which has always interested me. No book as complex, as rich as this one comes out of curiosity alone. You've spoken about one of the birthplaces of the book, so to speak, being a review you wrote in the year 2000 maybe, but you also speak at some point at the end of the book about coming across Fanon's picture on the jacket of your father's copy. So, what was that process like, from the first throb, as Nabokov would say, to the writing of the final book? How was that? How did that happen personally for you?
Sure. I mean, it's possible that the first throb was one that I didn't even perceive at the time, and maybe it was that first encounter with the photograph of Fanon on my father's copy of Black Skin, White Masks. He had the original Grove Press editions of both Black Skin, White Masks and The Wretched of the Earth. He didn't have A Dying Colonialism. I discovered that book later. In any case, it's true that when I first saw that book in my father's library, this was probably when I was about 15 or so, I was struck by the image of Fanon, very nattily dressed, with a kind of a brooding expression, very handsome man too. And I was equally struck by the description that the jacket gave of this West Indian doctor who had fought with the Free French forces against Nazism, and then who had fought against France with the Algerian rebels, and who had become this theoretician, spokesman of anti-colonialism. That story was intriguing to me. I mean, in part because I was developing an interest in radical intellectuals when I was in my teens. I first read Fanon at Columbia University in the early 1990s in two classes. One was in a class about the history of French writing in the 20th century, and at the time I read Black Skin, White Masks, and largely in the context of Fanon's debate with Négritude, with Senghor and Césaire, and with Sartre. Sartre's essay on the Jewish question, and also the essay that Sartre wrote as a preface to Senghor's anthology of Négritude poetry, Black Orpheus. And you know, the thing that and this is just an autobiographical note, but what moved me when I first read Black Skin, White Masks was the chapter on the lived experience of the black man, which was mistranslated as the fact of blackness, which led to all sorts of confusions, including the idea that Fanon was a black nationalist, which he certainly was not. The reason that chapter hit home for me is that I'd had my own encounters. I mean, I was already very interested in civil rights and the Black Power movement and so on, but I'd had an experience, a rather traumatizing experience myself when I was very young, when I was about 10 years old, with anti-Semitism. And my first response to this experience was not unlike Fanon's, which was to become violent. I wanted to become violent, and in fact I did. It's a surprise to many of my friends these days. I don't exactly cut a violent profile, but I did, and now in Fanon's case, of course, he immerses himself in Négritude. That's his second impulse. He has this voyage through Senghor, through Césaire, afterward. But what hit home for me was Fanon's description of how the bigot acquires the power to define who you are, and also the kind of corporeal effects that the experience of that kind of persecution can have. You know, the way that it makes your muscles more tense, the way that it produces a potentially violent reaction. Fanon, of course, when he wrote Black Skin, White Masks, a book that he published in 1952, had not yet become the champion of anti-colonial violence that he's sometimes stereotyped as. But there is a discussion in Black Skin, White Masks of violence, both with respect to this experience that he had on the train and also with respect to the experience of the West Indies and the fact that there had not been a slave revolt in the so-called old colonies by contrast with Haiti. So the question of violence is in Black Skin, White Masks as well. So this account of the corporeal effects of racism just made visceral sense to me. And I was reading this alongside James Baldwin. So Fanon seemed to me part of this global dialogue, this what Paul Gilroy has called a Black Atlantic intellectual tradition. Now, this was also the time that I was discovering the Israel-Palestine conflict. I grew up in a left liberal Jewish family that was secular. My parents had never gone to Israel, and they've never been since. And when the Intifada broke out in 1987, I wanted to understand what was going on because I think I had absorbed passively, complacently, this idea of Israel as this sanctuary for people who had been persecuted. I knew so little about it, and that launched me on this research project, in a sense. I was reading people like Simcha Flipan, Benny Morris at the time, before he became a champion of ethnic cleansing. I began to read Edward Said, and of course I ended up at Columbia in part because of my admiration for Edward Said, whom I was later lucky to know. And so when I read The Wretched of the Earth, and I read his account of the dynamics of the anti-colonial struggle, I mean, it was pretty easy to connect the dots. And then later on, sometime after my college education, I became very interested in Algeria. This was in the late 1990s. France was going through, there was a great wave of interest in the Algerian war and an effort to, maybe partially aborted effort to reckon with the legacy of torture in Algeria. It's important to recall that it was only in 1999 that the French government even acknowledged that it had fought a war in Algeria. The Algerian War was understood as an operation to maintain order, as a campaign of pacification. It was not understood. Of course, people talked about the guerre d'Algérie, but the French government, the French state rather, had not acknowledged this. And so in 1999, there were two extraordinary stories that were published in Le Monde. One was an account of the violent exploits of a French general named Paul Auxerès, who had carried out extrajudicial killings of Algerian leaders such as Ali Boumengel, who was a lawyer to the FLN, and Larbi Ben Midi, a great FLN leader in the region of Algiers. And the other story had to do with the torture suffered by an FLN militant named Louisette Iguilariz. And Louisette Iguilariz had been brutally raped in French custody. And she gave just a startling and powerful interview to the Le Monde correspondent in Algiers, Florence Boget. So I started to really think deeply about the Algerian War. Perhaps in a sense I was trying to think about Israel-Palestine indirectly. And what I found too was when I went to Algeria eventually, and this was after I published that first piece on Fanon, a review of David Macy's book in 2001, was that while Fanon was not widely remembered in Algeria, those who still cared about Fanon were particularly interested in him, not for his critique for his essay on violence, not even for his writings on colonialism. They were interested in him because of his piercing analysis of the defects, the authoritarianism, and the corruption of the post-independence elites. So Fanon had a vitality and actuality there that was quite striking. Much later, the scholar Jean Calfa and Robert Young, a specialist in post-colonialism, published an amazing collection of writings by Fanon. His early plays, he wrote 3 plays when he was in Lyon, 2 of which survived. His psychiatric writings, a number of his political writings, correspondence that had never appeared. It's a book called Essays on Freedom and Alienation, I believe. And the French edition was published by my French publisher, La Découverte, and I wrote a long piece about the book for the London Review of Books, and I remember feeling as if I had encountered a different Fanon than I knew. A Fanon who was an extremely creative psychiatrist, a Fanon whose vulnerabilities were much more evident. I had a sense of almost touching the man, and by then I was fortunate to have met a number of people who knew him. The historian Mohamed Harbi, an FLN leader who knew Fanon in Tunisia, and Mohamed Harbi is someone I've known since the early aughts and who's influenced me tremendously. Alice Cherki, his intern in Blida in Algeria, and later a colleague of his in Tunisia. And Alice I met and interviewed in the early aughts. And later, Fanon's secretary, Marie-Jeanne Manuelon, with whom I formed a friendship a few years before her death in 2019. So thanks to these people, I began to acquire this more intimate sense of a man who was far more interesting and far more complicated than the Fanon on posters. And it was after publishing that long essay about Fanon in the LRB that a friend of mine, the writer Pankaj Mishra, said to me, "Adam, what have you thought about turning this into a book?" And that was really the beginning. I started to think about whether I had anything more to say, and I found that, in fact, I did.
A little bit, but one of, if I may, David, one of the many interesting ways of reading this book is also to watch you try to be careful of possible canonization of Fanon. You say very early that celebrating Fanon can be tricky. We see you as readers, we see you trying to avoid turning Fanon into a prophet, into a man of answers, among other things, because this is opposites from what he thought of himself. He thought of himself as a man of questions.
Fais de moi toujours un homme qui interroge.
Exactly.
Oh, my body, make of me always a man who questions.
Exactly.
So in a sense, it would be a kind of, it would be an act almost of infidelity to Fanon, to turn him into a prophet.
So how did you negotiate this?
It's a delicate balance, and I didn't want to entirely lose the romance. I mean, Fanon is a charismatic and seductive figure. He's physically brave. I mean, this is a man who goes off to fight in the Second World War when he's 19 years old. He tried when he was 17 and he failed. He managed to do it when he was 19, and he had a shrapnel wound and won a Croix de Guerre. The person who pinned the Croix de Guerre on his lapel was actually the general Raoul Salan, who went on to become a very determined opponent of the Algerian struggle. So I wanted to honor that romance and to convey the drama of this life. I mean, Fanon exemplified, you could say, the existential man. I mean, someone who creates himself out of his choices, sometimes very dangerous and some would say even reckless choices. So that's very much a part of the story. But I also wanted to convey the failures, the self-deception. I enjoy being in a zone of ambivalence. It's kind of where I'm most comfortable, actually. So it wasn't difficult for me. Yeah, it wasn't difficult for me in that regard, and yeah.
I'm going to appropriate that phrase, a zone of ambivalence. Adam, you raised the question in what you said a few moments ago of violence, and so I want to turn to dimensions of the question of violence in Fanon, which obviously is one of the arenas in which Fanon has acquired a kind of notoriety. I also want at some point to be able to come back to the question of Fanon and the Caribbean, because I think that's a very complicated and for us Caribbeans a really provocative issue.
And they're connected, I think. I
Yes.
think those two questions are connected.
Yes, indeed. But one of the strategies of thinking about, very common strategies of thinking about Fanon and violence, is to imagine him in a prescriptive way as an advocate of violence. And I'm thinking here principally of The Wretched of the Earth. I mean, there is something worth talking about, I think, about the construction of an idea of an internalized violence in Black Skin, White Mask, and the way in which that is resolved, if you like, in anti-colonial revolution. But just staying in the vicinity of The Wretched of the Earth, we are more often than not invited to imagine Fanon's prescription of violence. And we don't often remember what it was imagined as an answer to. Absolutely. Namely the diagnosis of the colonial order as itself a structure of violence. Yeah, and not just a structure of violence, but in a certain sense a mute structure of violence, or a structure of, he says in that chapter somewhere that the colonial order is not a thinking machine, right there, and therefore there is a sense in which the way in which the problematic of violence emerges for Fanon is directly a response to his diagnostic of the colonial order. And it's always puzzled me. I mean, it's not that folk don't recognize, and in your book you do talk very much about the colonial order as a structure of violence. But there is a sense in which the problem of violence gets very quickly displaced onto the question of the individual's advocacy of violence. And so one part of my question is, why do you think that is so? The other part of the question is, which you raised also, which I think is no, but you have. I know you're good at this. Is that the relationship between the first chapter on violence and the chapter on colonial war and psychopathology are such, in some sense, as you suggest, at odds with each other in a certain respect. And one of the things about that chapter I think it's very important for Fanon. Where is violence located? Violence for Fanon comes to be located in a psychic structure and in an embodied psychic structure. And I've often thought, and I teach that this chapter all the time, if indeed Fanon is right, that we are all the embodiments of an introjected violence, what do we do with it?
Well, I don't know if that's a profound question, and I'm not sure that I can answer that, but I want to start with the first part of the question. First of all, as you pointed out, for Fanon, the violence of the colonized has to be understood as a counter-violence, because the world that they encounter, this frozen world which seeks to present itself as eternal, is a world created by violence. And this was certainly true of French Algeria. I'll just make a few points about that, just to evoke it. I mean, the French invaded Algeria in 1830, and over the course of the next 4 decades, about a third of the Algerian population perished of violence, of disease, of malnutrition. If you want to read a very vivid account of what the French did in Algeria, I recommend reading Alexis de Tocqueville's writings on Algeria. They are chilling, and Tocqueville was a liberal advocate of colonization. There were French soldiers would light fires outside of caves where Algerian families had taken sanctuary in the so-called enfumade. These families were asphyxiated. The French seized the best lands in Algeria and reduced many people to penury. So this world the world of French Algeria was a construct of colonial violence. There were efforts over the next, there were many efforts by Algerian politicians, political movements, to pursue peaceful reform in Algeria. There was the liberal politician Farhat Abbas, who was a Republican nationalist, the pharmacist from Sétif. There was the founding father of Algerian nationalism, Messali Haj, who was also, was a critical player in Algerian nationalist politics. And there were still others. And these movements, these Algerian political parties, sought to pursue political reform and found that at every turn, and I'm, of course, compressing a lot of history, they faced the implacable opposition of the Pieds Noirs, of the Europeans of Algeria. And the French government was unable to counter the Pieds Noirs. I mean, for example, there was an initiative called the Bloom Violet Project to provide citizenship for a small number of the so-called assimilated Algerians. That, too, was defeated under settler opposition. So I would not say that violence was the last resort of the FLN, because there were other Algerian nationalists at the time, particularly those grouped around Messali Haj, who believed that the time was not right to launch an armed struggle. But it was certainly not the first resort. That said, the members of the FLN did not attribute to violence the therapeutic properties that Fanon did. Fanon is, although I think it's unfair to see Fanon as an ecstatic proponent of violence, I think it's also misleading to imagine that he wasn't prescribing violence, because I believe that he was. And there are certainly passages in The Wretched of the Earth that speak to that. He believed that people who had been oppressed, humiliated, subjugated, who were wallowing in a kind of despair, who were incapable of expressing agency, he believed that for those people, violence provided a kind of shock therapy. And remember, Fanon was someone who utilized in his own therapy ECT. And so he felt that this shock therapy might be the jolt that they needed. He certainly did not go so far as Sartre, who said that the colonized kill 2 birds with 1 stone when they shoot a European. I mean, Fanon never exulted in violence in the manner that Sartre did in his preface. Sartre's preface is brilliant in many ways, but it also contains an almost Salinian celebration of violence. Fanon never went that far. But he certainly did advocate violence and believed that violence was a necessary and inevitable response to the violence of the colonial order. Now, why is it that Fanon himself is remembered and as a proponent of violence and reduced to it? Why is that? I think that's your second question. Because the fact is, Fanon was not alone. There have been many other militant figures, nationalists, who have made similar arguments. You will find the argument that violence is regenerative in the writings of many nationalists. You will find it in revisionist Zionism. Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin were great advocates of violence, delirious advocates of violence, you could even argue. And yet, and Sartre, as I mentioned, is far more ecstatic in his embrace of violence than Fanon is, and yet we don't remember Sartre as violent, even if today we make light of the preface because it goes to rhetorical extremes that are almost laughable. So why is that? Well, I actually think that it has a lot to do with Fanon's race. Fanon is a black thinker who is writing about violence. Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks writes that in the white imagination, in the white racial or racist imagination, the black man, and here he is speaking about the black man, represents the biological, represents the force of the irrational, represents instinct. And his argument, of course, is that the racism of white society had projected onto black people all of the impulses that they wanted to disavow in themselves. So it seems to me that this fixation on Fanon's essay on chapter on violence, this fetishization of Fanon as violent, reflects this, I think, deep structure of European thought about black violence. And I would argue that this is also true of the radical left that celebrates Fanon as a proponent of violence. I mean, I will just mention that there was one rather amusing review of this book in a kind of trendy art journal by a former pop critic for the New Yorker magazine who has since refashioned himself as a kind of armchair revolutionary. And this scribe took me to task for failing to celebrate violence as this uniquely collectivizing force. He wrote about violence as if he were Sartre in 1961. And he seemed to be utterly unaware of the fact that in Algeria, violence was as divisive as it was unifying. There were struggles among Algerians. The FLN killed many Algerians. In fact, the battle in Algeria began with the killing of Qaids, and the Algerian War included an absolutely brutal war between the FLN and the MNA, the Algerian National Movement, that included horrible massacres, and in the course of which over 4,000 Algerians were killed in France by other Algerians. But this writer, of course, utterly unaware of this, sang the praises of violence as this great collectivizing force. I think that this guy who is white was having a kind of a dream that we're all very familiar with, you know, the dream of the black revolutionary.
Adam, I've been instructed by superior powers to ask you to read something. But I have one last question.
Superior
it has
powers.
also been suggested to me that I have one last question, which I do amazingly. And it's it's an obvious one for my interests. In your note at the end of the book, you acknowledge that this can be understood also in terms of an act of imagination. There's imagination involved in writing such a book as this. Can we discuss this a little bit? This is a subject that fascinates me, obviously, because biography as well as historiography, dealing with the past, they deal with imagination in the sense that Paul Valéry said that the past is a mental state, it's a mental creation. Only when it's being told does the past exist, in a sense. So how aware were you of this, of the limits of imagination, of having to deal with different kinds of imagination during the writing of the book, moral imagination, emotional imagination, physical imagination, the creation of places, imagining places maybe that you don't know? Tell us a little bit.
No, it's true. That's a great question. It's true. I mean, while I wrote this book, I had been hoping to return to Algeria, where I've spent a fair amount of time, and my visa requests were refused, unfortunately, because Algeria the Algerian government was facing a protest movement, the Hirak, these weekly protests, and the Algerian authorities, according to my source, believed that I was giving false reasons for my trip, that in fact I was going there to report on the Hirak. And I did think about that. I'm not going to be able to go back and see the hospital in Blida, which was a shame. But no, it's a great question. I guess I felt that it was a work of imagination almost from the get-go. I certainly had no intention of inventing scenes or of introducing fictional characters, and this book is not a theoretical reflection on the archive in the manner of some recent history, notably Saidiya Hartman's brilliant work. But I knew that the story that I was telling was different from that of other books on Fanon. I was interested in what I felt were the tensions, often the productive tensions, in Fanon's life between his work as a healer, as a psychiatrist, as a doctor who was concerned above all with the health of his patients, on the one hand, and Fanon's role as a militant in a movement that was practicing armed struggle. There are numerous sets of tensions in this book that help to drive the narrative. Another is the tension between Fanon as rebel. I mean, Fanon very much starts out as a rebel. He's often described as an écorché vif, someone who is extremely sensitive, flayed alive. I mean, we see him protesting against abuses of power and acts of racism from a very young age. And Fanon is clearly very committed to the idea of self-emancipation, of self-sovereignty. This is a theme that runs through Black Skin, White Masks, which is, about him. I mean, in some ways it's a concealed a memoir. Certainly, the chapter, the lived experience of the black man is. But Fanon also becomes a member of a liberation movement that happens to be quite authoritarian. A movement founded on secrecy. I mean, what an interesting job for Fanon to have had. I mean, he's practicing psychoanalysis. I mean, he's not a psychoanalyst, but he was actually doing some psychoanalytic sessions. He's trying to get his patients to talk, and to talk about things that are very painful for them. And yet at the same time, he's part of an organization that is all about secrecy. It's all about not talking about certain things. And Fanon becomes aware very early in his time in Tunis that the FLN is lying about some very important matters. It's lying about the massacre in Malouza when supporters of the MNA, the Masalihaj group, are slaughtered by the FLN. And Fanon is the spokesman at the press conference in Tunis who claims that the French killed these peasants. Not that long afterward, the journal that Fanon was co-editing, the Algerian newspaper El Mujahid, publishes the obituary of his rabbi/imam, I'm trying to be ecumenical here, Aban Ramdan. Aban Ramdan had been lured to Morocco by his comrades and strangled. He was strangled by the Boussouf boys. And yet 6 months later, his death, the El Mujahid announces that he has died on the fields of honor. He's died fighting the French. Once again, Fanon knows this is not true, but there's not really very much that he can do. So how did he live this experience? Well, I know, for example, that Fanon blamed himself for Aban Ramdan's death because he confessed to this when he met with Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. When I read that Fanon, when I read in A Dying Colonialism, his 1959 book on the Algerian struggle, that he condemns with a heavy heart the almost, and I'm quoting him, the almost primordial physiological brutality with which some of our brothers, nos frères, fling themselves into violence. It's hard not to think of something like Malouza. And so, when I was in college, I remember I was very influenced by a style of reading that I learned from the philosopher Althusser, I think he called it symptomatic reading, and it's where you focus on certain contradictions in a text and also on what he called the structuring absence. And so I was always thinking in those terms when I read Fanon's writings, and I found that I could make use of the writings to illuminate the life, and I could use moments in the life to illuminate the writing. And so this became a book about essentially the lived experience of Frantz Fanon. And I always saw him as a character. And I also saw him as a character who was ultimately elusive because he did not leave behind memoirs. He had contempt for those who wrote them. And so I knew that there were going to be serious limits, and that ultimately the Fanon that I produced would be in some ways a subjective Fanon. Other books about Fanon can and will be written.
An interpretation.
Other interpretations. I mean, it's funny. It's been noted by some readers that I write often about friends of Fanon, comrades of Fanon, who had Jewish backgrounds. These were often Jews of North African extraction who were leftists or Marxists and who joined the anti-colonial cause. And I've been asked, why do you mention their origin? And one rather hostile pro-Israel reviewer thought that I was seeking to praise Jews who renounce their Jewishness while praising black people who proclaim their blackness. It was a rather bizarre interpretation, but there's no question that I am drawing attention to figures who were part of the twilight of Jewish modernity, a term that I'm borrowing from one of my own intellectual imams, the Italian historian Enzo Traverso. I think it's important to remember that these people existed, that they were very active in these struggles, and that they had a different conception of what it meant to come from such a background than Zionism would have us believe. So yes, in that sense, this is a book that bears the mark of its author, and I don't pretend to scientific objectivity, which I don't believe in anyway.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about something. You know, there's a French philosopher who wrote a very big book about Marx, and he said that Marxism is the total sum of contresens, of flawed interpretations of Marx. And so he pretended to have the good interpretation, I guess. And it's a good book, but that's not exactly what you do about Fanonism, because in fact, and it's a very, I don't understand how you kept the balance, because you don't say, well, you say he's not a black nationalist, but you also show that there can be a legitimate black nationalist use of Fanon, or an identitarian decolonial, etc. Totally. And you don't claim it as an author, you don't claim it for your own agenda. That's not what you're doing. But you have political opinions. You have we have discussed a lot about this. But it's a very interesting and very fine balance, I would say, that you maintain. And you maintain another essay, some of the ones that are in Writers and Missionaries. And I thought it very interesting, because I was a bit afraid. I saw this book evolving as your translator, and I thought, oh my God, there's a lot of hysterical and unproductive posturing now these days about who has the right to talk about whom and things like that. And it didn't happen a lot around your book. I don't know, I didn't read all the reviews. That's interesting, and maybe that's due to this kind of possibility to give the space to anybody to find their own reflection or their own tone in Fanon, but also showing, yes, he says that, but then you can also read it from another angle. It might be partly contradictory, but it's also some kind of completion, things like that. And another very practical question that I don't know how I didn't think about it, and we should ask our publisher, but do you think you will have the possibility to present the French version in the French West Indies, in Martinique at some time? I mean, is there any people trying to do this, or that would be really nice?
Thanks, Mark. Mark knows this book probably better than I do at this point. I would love to. That would be wonderful. I will be presenting it in Algeria because it's going to be published in May by Barzac. So I'm very much looking forward to. I think that now I think it would be hard for them to say you're coming to actually secretly report on internal politics while claiming that you've published a book. Well, you never know. Algeria is a very opaque country. But there have been some polemics around the book, but given the hysteria of the moment, they haven't really turned on my interpretation of Fanon, the historical figure, really. They've turned on Israel-Palestine. And so I've been accused by some of being a kind of crypto-Zionist, and by others of being a self-hating Jew. But this is something I'm pretty accustomed to anyway. So, as for in a sense, this goes back to the question that David was asking earlier about the incomplete, contradictory, even incoherent aspect of Wretched of the Earth, particularly around the differences between the first chapter and the last chapter. In my view, this incoherence, and I'm not using the term uncharitably, I mean that it really is hard to figure out how to read The Wretched of the Earth. I mean, is it a work of full-fledged advocacy of violence, or is it a lament for the legacy of colonial violence? In a sense, it's both. But in my view, this incoherence means that we are free to interpret it in various ways, and I mean, to reprise an old existential theme, right? Our freedom comes with we have the burden of freedom. how do we read this work? And I do think that it can be read legitimately in different ways. And this is the reason that although I'm skeptical of certain aspects of Afro-pessimist readings of Fanon, I say very clearly that there are dimensions of Fanon that Afro-pessimism has captured very vividly. There's a passage in Black Skin, White Masks where Fanon evokes this sterile, arid zone of non-being that he associates with a blackness that has not achieved reciprocal recognition. Fanon did not regard this as an immutable curse. He actually believed that through struggle it could be overcome. And yet, there is something about Fanon's evocation of the experience of racism in a white-dominated society that the Afro-pessimists have picked up on, and they've made something of it. And so, there is Fanon, there's the historic Fanon, and then there's the history of Fanonism, which, although it's not as multifarious yet as Marxism, is beginning to compete pretty strongly with it. The reason that I titled that last chapter, the epilogue, Specters of Fanon, it's not simply that I wanted to evoke the ways in which Fanon haunts the present. I also want to suggest that Fanon's future as a thinker resides in these specters. It's not in the historical Fanon, which is very different.
Wow, that's actually very lucky because I was right next to the microphone. There was a question that was opened up earlier about the Caribbean and Fanon. I always think Fanon as being from the Caribbean, partly because, in fact, that's where I'm from. So I wonder how much the Caribbean, and I haven't had a chance to read the book.
Figures very strongly in the book.
Okay. So here's an interesting question about that. There's a question about imagination. There was the process of research and writing, etc. There's a question of language as well, right? I mean, Fanon is much better known in the Anglophone world than in the Francophone world. And there was an interesting attempt in 2018 by Raphaël Confiant, who considers himself to be one of the sort of heirs of Fanon, who writes a biography in narrative form. And it's one of his more recent books that was actually written in French, because he abandoned French several years ago to only write in Creole, but comes back to the French to do this narrativized version of Fanon as a fictionalized character informed by history. Did that work feature in the sort of elaboration of the biography of Fanon that you have delivered for us?
You're asking whether Confiant's book did? Or is that the question?
Did you run into it? Did you?
No, I'm aware of the book.
Okay.
It didn't figure strongly in it, but no, it did not. That said, the Caribbean and its intellectual and political history form a very deep part of the book because, in my view, Fanon remained a West Indian thinker through and through, even as he went to Algeria and reinvented himself as an Algerian and an African. Albert Memmi, the Tunisian Jewish writer, published 10 years after Fanon's death an article in Esprit, the left-wing Catholic journal, called The Impossible Life of Frantz Fanon. And in that piece, which is quite critical of Fanon, Memmi, who never met Fanon, but who was aware of him and was rather envious of his reputation, argued that Fanon's real problem was not how to be Algerian, it was how to be West Indian. And his argument essentially was that everything that Fanon had done after the publication of Black Skin, White Masks was a tragic deviation from his reckoning with his black identity, with his relationship to Martinique, that in a sense he'd betrayed his true calling. Interestingly, this is an argument, I'm not sure whether they're aware of it, but this is an argument that is echoed by Afro-pessimism. Most Afro-pessimists reject Fanon's writing after Black Skin, White Mask. What was Fanon doing, with Algerians? Why was he doing that? I mean, Frank Wilderson, has in fact expressed rather negative views of Palestinians, right? Why should black people be solidarizing with Palestinians? They should focus on themselves. So there's an interesting continuity between Memi's argument, which is influenced in some ways by his own embrace of Zionism after his disenchantment with Arab nationalism, and the Afro-pessimist view, which also tends to substitute ontology for history, a very kind of fatalistic understanding of race. But in my view, Fanon continued, even after he left, to reckon with the West Indies and with the fate of the West Indies and with the culture and poetry of the West Indies. It's true that Fanon's legend is that he is the person who never returned, whereas Aimé Césaire is the one who goes back to Martinique and publishes his great poem, Notebook of Return to the Native Land. That said, you find metaphors of plantation society throughout the wretched of the earth. And for Fanon, the colonized is the slave of modern times. This is not language that you're going to find in a lot of other anti-colonial writings. This is a Caribbean account of societies like French Algeria. Which poets is he quoting in The Wretched of the Earth? Jacques Roumain. In fact, it's from Jacques Roumain that he gets the title, although the title, of course, is also a reference to the International. Léon Gontran Damas, one of the founders of Négritude, and Aimé Césaire, above all. So Fanon, I think, continued to think about and to pay tribute to the West Indies. He sometimes said to Marie-Jeanne Manoillan, his secretary, that the Corrèze is for you what Martinique is for me. We know that he listened very frequently to West Indian music. It's true that he also made allusions to jazz, but it was really West Indian music that he felt most passionately about. So in my view, The Wretched of the Earth is an account of the colonial condition that only a Caribbean thinker could have written.
If I can just add very quickly to that, all of us in Jamaica in the 1970s read The Wretched of the Earth as a Caribbean text. And contra Memi, Fanon is there are many, many Caribbean figures who formed their identities through the detour of the African continent. And therefore, in that sense, Fanon is Fanon's trajectory and the moment of the formation of his political consciousness is a very, very familiar trajectory. He lived through displacement, as many, many West Indians do.
Well, yeah, his thought is a nomadic thought. But it's also true that, although, as you point out, he was very important in Jamaica. Orlando Patterson wrote an early piece about Fanon. I think he published the piece in 1966. At the same time, there was a considerable ambivalence about Fanon in Martinique.
Martinique, for sure.
If you read Chamoiseau or Glissant about Fanon, they're full of admiration for him. Glissant writes that Fanon was the only one who, il était le seul à passer à l'acte. He was the only one who went into action. He describes Fanon's decision to go to Algeria as the one great historical moment in West Indian intellectual life, and yet at the same time, they have their reservations about Fanon.
The heir to Fanon, in a certain sense, in the Caribbean is Walter Rodney.
Great example. That's a great. In fact, I mentioned Walter Rodney in the book because when Walter Rodney went to Washington, D.C., he met with a group of African Americans who were inclined to support Joseph Savimbi because of color, and Walter Rodney published a scathing text in which he defended the Marxist alternative, which was Creole and Mestizo. And you could argue, in fact, that Rodney's critique of Savimbi and his warnings to this audience were properly Fanonian, and an argument against a certain kind of calcified race thinking.
We have time maybe for one short question.
Okay, very quickly. I have two questions. I will ask them in succession. Firstly, how can we best situate Fanon in the kind of African political thought, if it always is? And how does your work help us make sense of that? Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah, how can we situate Fanon in the canon of African political thought or black political thought, and how does your work help us make sense of that? Secondly, just to use Quentin Skinner's phrase, historical absurdity, how can we kill this historical absurdity of Fanonian reflection? So the idea of thinking that Fanon, the canon of Fanon contains some perennial truth of colonialism, truth of racism, and we can use that reflection to think about contemporary problems. Don't you think, to a certain extent, that we are taking Fanon too far? Thank you.
You know, I don't feel that I'm expert enough to pronounce on Fanon's use today, which is quite various on the African continent. I mean, he means different things to different groups of people. In South Africa, he's an important reference point for radical students and for members of Joseph Malema's radical populist party. He'll mean something rather different in a place like Senegal, or for that matter, in Mali. And so I'm somewhat, I mean, I don't feel that I can really speak to the entirety. I mean, the African it's a big continent. But what I will say is that Fanon did write about what he saw as the danger, that if a more expansive, egalitarian form of citizenship were not established in post-independence African societies, there would be a regression to other forms of identity formation. And one thing that we have seen in the case of South Africa, and but also in the case of Algeria, is that migrants have been subject to really horrifying levels of racism and violence. Other Africans, black Africans in South Africa, and African refugees in Algeria. And I think that Fanon was very alert to this problem and would have seen it as a reflection of the failures of state formation after independence.
Sadly, we have to end this fascinating conversation now. I'd like to thank the three of you, and we can take the conversation off stage. Merci.